All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So let's actually start first with kind of reviewing what we talked about yesterday first, okay? We went in details in regards to pretty much we started from this ayah. قُلْ هُوَ الْقَادِرُ عَلَى أَن يَبْعَثَ عَلَيْكُمْ عَذَابًا مِّن فَوْقِكُمْ أَوْ مِن تَحْتِ أَرْجُلِكُمْ أَوْ يَلْبِسَكُمْ شِيَعًا. And we went in details about يَلْبِسَكُمْ شِيَعًا and the relationship between division and between weakness. And certainly, we also went in details and kind of talked a little bit about the division that we are living in right now and its relationship with our weakness and how the different ahadith, and we went into different ahadith narrated by Sahih Muslim and other ahadith that the Prophet ﷺ was making the dua that the enemies would not be the ones, in other words, external enemies, would not be the ones to basically bring an end and totally eliminate the ummah, and that our enemies would be from within. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to be having external enemies coming from the outside. And we talked about different external enemies, whether the Mongols, the Crusades, the Persians, the Byzantine Empire, which they used to call it Rome, and certainly there will be other nations as well. And in fact, even there's that piece about Surah Al-Isra and whether Surah Al-Isra and the ayat that relate to Bani Israel coming back and causing all the destruction or not, is that necessarily speaking about the times that we're living in today or not? That's that area of differences of opinions between the modern scholars of tafsir. Could that necessarily be something that is happening right now? And then probably, because there are a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ talks about, لا تقوم الساعة حتى يقاتل المسلمون اليهود, where the Prophet ﷺ actually speaks about Judgment Day not happening, meaning that this is something that is one of the signs of Judgment Day until the Muslims and the Jews would fight one another, and to the point that the rock and the tree would say, Ya Muslim, Ya Abdullah, هذا يهودي خلفي تعال فاقتل. O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Is this necessarily talking about all Jews, or is this talking about the specific Jews that were occupying Palestine? That was one thing. Number two, is this talking about literally a tree speaking and a rock speaking and saying this? Or is this talking about a tree and a stone basically resembling a metaphorical thing, which basically is talking about the landowners, or perhaps that some landowners would be there, meaning some country people, farmers are still there, basically talking about the presence of perhaps Jews slash Zionists that are occupying the land, and that they would be basically occupying the West Bank, and that the other army would be on the East Bank. What are we looking at East Bank? Are we talking about Jordan? Are we talking about Syria? Are we talking about Jordan, Syria together? Are we talking about that being the East Bank, and that the West Bank would basically be what is today occupied by Israel, etc.? So what are we looking at? Are we talking about some people still remaining in the West Bank, and those would be the people that would know better about perhaps the landscape of that area, and who's hiding and where they're hiding and all of that? What are we talking about here? Okay, now is that or those hadith and is that surah, or the different combinations of ayat, are they necessarily talking about something that is happening right now, or can this be something that may happen again? So they would probably, let's say, decide to maybe leave Palestine and go to Greece, which right now Greece is saying that they're afraid of the Israeli presence, and they're ownership over different homes and different I guess they're afraid of all that new realty ownership that they are right now coming in, and they're afraid of a new occupation that they could be planning and to make Greece be their new place of occupation. Anyhow, so is this something that might happen again in the future? This is a possible thing. So it can happen that they might actually decide to unoccupy Palestine to a certain, let's say, time, and then occupy it later on again and say, hey, we're coming back and we're bringing in our legacy or whatever it is, similar to what the Crusades had done in the past. The Crusades, they were defeated and then they came back in again and lived again. And it was something that we had seen in history, that it can happen, that a certain power might lose and weaken and get defeated in a certain area and then regain its power and come back. So is this ayah, or are those ayat in Surah Al-Isra talking about the first time, talking about the second time? Is there going to be a second time, or what does this look like? So you do have some scholars actually saying that no, it is actually speaking about this time. Why deny that this isn't speaking about this time? And some are really critical about making and speaking of those ayat to say that this is speaking about this time and not another time. And the other scholars, they would say, well, why can't we say that it can be repeated and it would speak about it again? But we definitely can see that these ayat are describing things that are happening during our times as well. Anyhow, regardless of that, so we could say that يلبسكم شيعا, we went in details. It can be from the external enemy basically making us into divisions, and basically certain people from within us may be the agency acting on behalf of the enemy, and therefore, of course, bring us that weakness. وَيُذِيقَ بَعْضَكُمْ بَأْسَ بَعْضٍ, and that's basically our own weakness coming from our own selves, where we're ending up fighting one another. Or is this talking about the enemy basically coming and attacking the ummah as a result of our own weakness in our faith? In other words, our weakness is what had gotten the enemy basically stronger. Is that the case? That was one of those opinions. وَكَذَّبَ بِهِ قَوْمُكَ وَهُوَ الْحَقِّ قُلْ لَسْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ بِوَكِيلٍ. And your people had denied it, but it is the truth. But here's the thing. When you look at this ayah, وَكَذَّبَ بِهِ قَوْمُكَ, well, we already know that they had denied it. Why is this ayah repeating وَكَذَّبَ بِهِ قَوْمُكَ, that they had basically denied it? We already know that one. Well, that's a form of scolding. This is توبيخ and تقريع. What's the difference in Lugha Arabiya? When you say taqriyah, this is actually pretty much coming from up above and giving you that shake and telling you, listen, don't you recognize what you are saying and the faults and the gaps within your argument and all of that? This is that taqriyah. Tawbih is to sometimes belittle the person and let them recognize, let's say, those faults, and let them recognize by taking away the ego. Listen to this one. When you say tawbih, you're diminishing the ego. When you say taqrir, you're basically trying to expose the argument. Okay? Exposing the argument and letting the person recognize that area that they might be confusing. But tawbih is when you put down their ego. Why is this different than that? Because this is important in discipline. There are times And I know that in Western psychology, they don't recognize التوبيخ and التقريع as a method of discipline because they would think that this is a method that is toxic. They'll call it toxic. But Islam actually considers it as a useful method in order to discipline. Keep this one in mind. They will call that method as toxic because they're all about just encouraging the person even when the person is doing wrong. So even let's say a woman went to perhaps this therapist and was telling this therapist that her mother was continuously just correcting her behavior and that her mother was telling her of all these different things and it's hurting her mentally and all of that. So in the Western psychology, oh, since it's hurting you this much and since it's basically making you depressed and all of that, then your mother is a toxic relationship and she's causing this type of this type of behavior that or this type of illness that you are in, then therefore you need to stay away from your mother. Okay. But in Islam, what the mother could have been doing from tawbih, I need you to clean your room. You not cleaning your room is basically making you in the situation that you are in, or probably using taqriya. Taqriya is what? Taqriya is that's what you are doing is not acceptable. What you are doing, and probably even sometimes using the method of using certain hurtful words. And what hurtful words means to basically take down the ego from letting that ego basically control her arrogance and not let her see her mistakes, that's a method that was used. Yet, it's important to say that that's not useful for every single person. Just keep that one in mind. التوبيخ والتقريع is not necessarily something that we would use for every single person, for every single personality. It needs hikmah in how we use this method and who we use it for and who is using it. I want you to keep that one in mind because indeed, sometimes using it at the wrong time, at the wrong person may lead to indeed very serious consequences and may in fact lead to serious consequences that may demolish and totally demolish the person's psychology, the person may not be at that level of probably handling such words. So just keep that one in mind. It needs hikmah, and we wouldn't necessarily use it on everyone. But you could see that the Quran used this method, and وَكَذَّبَ بِهِ قَوْمُكَ, and your people had denied it, and it is the truth. That's that. What was it? That was that taqriya. Your people had denied it, even though it's the truth. What was it using? كَذَّبَ بِهِ قَوْمُكَ. It was exposing that they had denied the truth. You're just denying the truth. And what it taqriya contains is a place in a position of speaking from above. That's a taqriya. It also contains speaking from above, but it also contains that area where it's letting you basically see your arrogance and your ego not be at the same level that you are used to seeing it in. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind that this method of tawbih and taqriya, like I said, when we're speaking about tawbih and taqriya, it depends on the society, it depends on who is using it, and it depends on who it's being used at. So we have to be really careful. Certainly in the traditional disciplining, this is used commonly, and we had seen that it basically was useful, at least within that context, and it made many basically be capable of one, avoiding wrong, staying on discipline, etc. But of course, this method may not be something that the newer generation is probably used to. And unfortunately, of course, we're getting more and more fragile and I would say entitled children that are not only not capable of handling truth, but not capable of handling even a fearful discipline that's putting them on the right path. نسأل الله لنا ولهم الثبات. اللهم آمين. قل لست عليكم بوكيل, and say I'm not a warrant over you. In other words, I'm not going to be responsible, and let them feel that they are the ones that are responsible for the consequence and where this is going. Now, لكل نبأ مستقر, for every single basically story or an ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned, it would basically unfold for them to see. In other words, you're letting them then stay on the lookout and actually see with their own eyes that things will unfold as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned. And this is, I know it's hard as a parent to sometimes know with your experience where this is going, where their choices, their decisions, and where their behavior is taking them. And it's really hard to know very well that this is going the wrong direction, but sometimes you have no choice but to actually let them recognize where this is going and let them recognize that you were right about a lot of different things and let them just decide to go on. You tried to stop them, but they still were determined to continue, and just let them figure out the consequences may sometimes be really dangerous. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not easy as a parent to see this. I know very well. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect our children. وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ الَّذِينَ يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُم. We pretty much stayed on this area right there for a long time. And if you see the people that would engage in our verses, then you have to step back. You have to stay away. Why? Because it was right there. It was talking about, well, what you should be saying, and then it was coming from a different stance. It was coming from a stance, well, it was a third person now, well, first person, third person, and now it's basically coming back to tell you, well, here's a tip. Here's what you need to embrace in order to keep yourself protected from all of this. If you see the people engaging in ayatina, in our verses, or going against the principles of the Lord Almighty, then your responsibility, أعرض عنهم. You have to just turn away. Why? Because you definitely can say that they were denying everything. You tried to give the da'wah, but of course, that method of da'wah, when you were using all those different arguments, but they were still putting up their ego, you didn't have the power. Now, here's one thing. We have to keep in mind the context of this ayah was actually in Mecca. Okay. Because the surah itself is a Meccan surah. So when you look at this was actually in Mecca, what does that really mean? That means that the Muslims did not yet have the power. They were still a very small minority. And if you were to look at the majority of the Muslims, they were still Muslim in secret. Many of them did not disclose their faith in fear of different harm, in fear of persecution, in fear of torture, etc. So they couldn't just slip out when something is not perhaps following the ayat or perhaps according to the principles, etc., because perhaps the person that is talking is probably their parent or probably a chieftain or probably an important person. To slip out is to actually show disrespect and to show disapproval. So some of them were in fear. How can I actually go out? فأعرض عنهم. Now, here's the thing. So when you look at this ayah, فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, that you should turn away, is this ayah coming in first? Was this ayah coming in first, or was this ayah coming in first? وَمَا عَلَى الَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ مِنْ حِسَابِهِم مِّن شَيْءٍ. Well, wait a minute. Why would you say that that ayah is coming in first when it was actually right there in the chronology? It's right here, right before it. And certainly this ayah, وَذَرِ الَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا دِينَهُمْ لَعِبًا وَلَهْوًا وَغَرَّتْهُمُ الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا. It's coming right there. But here's one thing that you have to remember. Certain ayat, it could be that this ayah was actually revealed before this ayah, even though Surah Al-An'am was actually revealed as one whole block. Just remember that one. Okay. But there are certain ayat that may have been revealed later, and the Prophet ﷺ would tell the Sahaba to annex and to add this ayah after this verse in this surah, before this verse, and so forth. Okay, so when you look at, and some scholars debated with whether it was abrogated slash mansukha or not. So why would they even debate that? Let's look at the following ayah. وَمَا عَلَى الَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ مِنْ حِسَابِهِم مِّن شَيْءٍ. So in other words, the ones that have taqwa, at the end, here's the question. So I'm supposed to basically step back, and when they're engaging in conversations that are anti-Islam, anti the principles of Islam, I'm supposed to step back and basically not get engaged, not only in the conversation, but this whole environment, I'm supposed to isolate myself from. Okay. Okay. وَإِمَّا يُنْسِيَنَّكَ. And if I had forgotten this particular advice in this particular rule, then after that, I have to recognize the advice again. So if I had forgotten at one point that, oh, I wasn't supposed to be around these people, you forgot that principle. Okay. Now, after this reminder, keep yourself tentative, and just remember what advice and what tip we had given you in order to stay protected. So that's why it said, فَلَا تَقْعُدْ بَعْدَ الذِّكْرَى. After this reminder, now you have to remember again. You can't continuously but say, I had forgotten, I had forgotten. Now you've got that reminder. This is important. Now, when you look at the other ayah, وَمَا عَلَى الَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ, and for the pious people, the people that are living in taqwa, they're not going to be accountable for their actions, the disbelievers' actions, or at least the Muslims that are possibly engaging in يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا, engaging in haram conversations. So in that situation, certainly you're not held accountable for them. Is this laying out somewhat of, let's call it, an exception, that there are times فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, you're supposed to basically isolate yourself from them. But what if I'm not capable of isolating myself? If I isolate myself from them, let's give an example. You're working at a company, okay? And when you're working at this company, the CEO of the head of the company basically says words, or probably speaks about maybe things that are not within our principle. Starts talking about his girlfriend and how he's living his life with his girlfriend and blah, 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 all that stuff. Okay. Now, this is against your principle, because to you, this is zina. But to him, this is basically his life, and their life is based on zina. If you are to get up, and you as an employee in this company, and أعرض عنهم, to get up and probably leave this conference, that of course it would be seen by probably your direct boss that you had left when the CEO was talking and all of that. You weren't comfortable with this kind of conversation. And of course, that wouldn't look good, at least in your eyes, in the eyes of your boss, and certainly your coworkers and all of that. Okay, so is that something that this ayah is basically telling us? Well, you're not held accountable for the sin that they're doing. In other words, what he's talking about in terms of all the haram things, that we're not talking about, speaking about haram things, or, I mean, directly, if you know what I mean, like going too detailed in and too graphic in his description. We're not talking about that. That one's too obvious. Okay, you shouldn't be around that. That one's too obvious. But I'm just talking about, just in general. And I'm not talking about too detailed in kufr, or too detailed where it's literally a fitna right there. Okay, so in that situation, when you see this ayah, وَمَا عَلَى الَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ مِنْ حِسَابِهِم مِّن شَيْءٍ, at the end, you as a person of taqwa, you're not going to be held accountable for what they are saying and what their life is living like. And therefore, وَلَكِنْ ذِكْرَى لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ. But what you're supposed to be doing is possibly, when you get the chance, to give the reminder, possibly, and maybe they will get into taqwa. But what if I cannot remind and say anything, and I probably won't get the chance to speak about, why a marriage is better than zina and all of that, because of course I'm probably not only not given enough time, but these people don't even base their life based on a certain principle because they're atheists. Okay, then in that situation, speak about as much as you can, speak about perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, try to do your piece of da'wah. But if that is going farther, okay, if that's going further, then in that situation, you have to keep in mind وَذَرِ الَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا دِينَهُمْ لَعِبًا وَلَهْوًا وَغَرَّتْهُمُ الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا. There's a certain point you just really have to leave and isolate yourself from those that had taken their religion. What do you say taking their religion? Is this talking about a Christian not taking their religion seriously? No. When you say اتخذوا دينهم, whether it's a Muslim that's not taking his religion seriously, in other words, they're either taking it as something that they're joking around with, or they're probably just considering their entertainment up above it and their pleasures up above the principles of the deen, or whether this is talking about people, even if it's an atheist, that is their deen. An atheist deen, meaning their vision about life, their vision about God, their vision about the hereafter, all of that, this is their deen. To deny the hereafter, to deny God, that's a deen. Okay? A deen is any belief that it regards to one, God, hereafter, Jannah, Nar, your life, death, and what that life means, and all of that, that's deen. Whether you deny it or whether you believe that Buddha is basically your place of the place of I guess inspiration, or whether it's Confucius, or whether it's Jesus, or whether it's Yahweh, or whatever it is. Okay, so at the end, that's a deen. Okay, and to call those religions as a deen, lakum dinukum waliya deen, there's nothing wrong with calling their faith as a deen, because even the ayah says, lakum dinukum, you have your deen and I have my deen. Okay, yes, inna deena indallahi al-Islam, which basically would mean that the accepted religion, the accepted faith in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Islam. This is not to say that what they are practicing is also called a deen. Okay, so inna deena, that is to say that the accepted faith is al-Islam. But lakum dinukum waliya deen, You have your faith and I have my faith. Whether that faith is specifying a specific God or specifying a specific deity or specifying a specific principle or not, at the end, it's called a religion. Any faith, even if it's in fact denying religion and denying faith, it's still considered a religion. It's what you believe about the genesis of the world. It's what you believe about God. It's what you believe. You decided to be an atheist, someone that denies God. At the end, you basically have your understanding of the foundation of creation. You consider that the foundation of life is basically based on this cell that grew on its own, and that life is matter in motion, and that there's a beginning of life, basically starting with these different cells, basically working and shaping in billions and billions of years and whatever it works. At the end, you basically have your definition of Genesis. You have your definition of how this life is going to end. You have your definition of this life basically having no purpose. Therefore, you have no purpose. And yeah, there you go. Therefore you have no purpose. That's a real good one. Okay. If that's what they believe, so yeah, that's what they were saying, not me. وذر الذين اتخذوا دينهم لعبا ولهوا وغرتهم الحياة الدنيا. So at the end, you basically ذر. Now, what's the difference between ذر and أعرض? We're taking these two words. Hold on. Okay, taking these two words. Hold on. We're going to expose and let's see. Okay, let me use this one and kind of make it bigger so we could actually see it, right? Let's see. So the first one was أعرض. Okay. And here's that one. And dhar is different. Okay. When you say a'rad, the first one right here, that one actually means you're literally taking a stance. You're literally going away. You're isolating yourself from them. Okay. Dhar is actually dust. But this isn't talking about dust. Idhar can be dust. Idhar is also ants. Anything that is really small is basically called a dhar. And that's why we would say, for example, idhariyat. What are idhariyat? It's basically the wind, in those little particles in the wind, in the air, those little tiny particles. Okay, والذاريات ذروة فالحاملات وقرا. Okay, so idhariyat, those tiny particles, is it in the clouds or is it in the wind? Okay, at the end, little tiny particles. So when you say wadari, it's like you are taking a stance. Yes, you could be on your own. You could be seen as a tiny particle and you could be on your own. And they're not necessarily giving you, let's say, this appreciation, this consideration. And at the end, you basically, dhar is to also let go. Why let go? It's like, it's not something that is important to you. Let go. Okay, so dhar can mean to let go. Dhar can mean something that is really small. So in other words, it's changing your vision in how you see these people around you. It's important. How do you see these people around you? So it's telling you dhari ladina. In the word dhari, it's like, just let them go. Don't give them a bigger piece, a bigger of any importance in your life. You just got to let go. Maybe you're giving them more than what they really deserve. So, in other words, just let them go. Let them fly away. Let them go. It's just like a dust. Let it go. And that there is basically teaching us how to see things in the true image of what they really are. Sometimes you're exaggerating certain people's importance. Sometimes you just gotta flick it, let it go. And that's why it said, who are these people that are just gotta let go and not give them that place of importance that they don't really deserve? And the ayah said, وَذَرِ الَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا, and let those that would take their religion as لَهْوًا وَلَعِبًا, those that would take their religion as their place of mockery. لعب. What is اللعب? اللعب is to play. In other words, what are they doing? So they're basically taking their religion as a place of play, meaning what? Meaning they're not taking it seriously. Every time you would bring it up, you would speak about it with passion, for example, and speak about the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with passion. They would probably laugh at your passion, or probably call you a fanatic, or you're just being, come on, bro, what's going on with you? It's not that bad. It's not that serious. Let it go, etc. What are they doing? They're mocking your passion. So in that situation, you are the one that's supposed to take that other stance and dharhum. Just let them go. Don't give them that exaggerated, don't exaggerate their impact and their influence and basically their position. Don't let them be that area that considers themselves as somehow higher and more worthy of you. That's that area. You are the one that has the greater worth if you are not taking your religion as la'iban wa lahwa. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching you how to value yourself. Value yourself by isolating yourself from those that do not value. Who are those people that don't value? The people that don't take their religion seriously, i.e., taking their religion as a place of la'ib, as a place of play, as a place of pleasure, as it's not too big of a deal. Why are you being too serious about it? Let's just enjoy a good time. We'll make tawbah later. What's the big idea? And certainly peer pressure is actually one of those influences on boys and girls as well. Peer pressure is actually, I used to do chaplaincy in prisons. Most of those that are in prison are either the ones that were the bullies and very intelligent, extremely intelligent, but it's so sad that they use their intelligence for the wrong thing. All right. They could be the leaders, or they could be the ones to be the followers, the ones that were bullied, the ones that lack confidence, and they end up basically, again, still being bullied by their inmates. So you would have later these followers, they would later get the impression that to be strong is to be a bully. Using that psychology of making you feel that nothing is serious, that they're really strong enough to go against the rule. Now I want you to look at this one, because with the atheist religion, in the ideology of atheism, it's always the survival of the fittest. The survival of the fittest suggests that if you basically are the one to go against the rule, and you are the one to not be following the natural process and the natural rule, then you are the one that's going to survive. And therefore, considering that the whole social evolution is all about the survival of the fittest, and even when you look at politics, look at this one. When you look at politics, you look at, for example, he's named Napoleon the Great. He's called Caesar the Great. And if you were to look at those, they were the ones to have actually committed the most massacres. Whoever is the one to commit the most massacres is later going to be basically considered as the great. In other words, regardless of their history, if they manage to be in power, then they are the ones that basically had deserved to be considered the great and to be the ones that are appreciated, that they had mastered to be in this elite power, elite position, in this magnificent position, and therefore, regardless of the method used. And that's why you would see these bullies and leaders specifically in the West. You would be speaking of what makes humanitarian and what makes humane and what humane behaviors and all of that. And they don't really care, because politics to them is not about adopting the principle. Politics is about knowing how to go beyond the principle to get to a certain position in power. It's not about adopting a principle. And only the ones that recognize that this game, that is the game that politicians are playing, are the ones to basically expose those things, or the ones to end up basically trying to bring awareness to the people and expose the politicians that may sometimes be heard, and sometimes they would not be heard because they don't have the money. The politicians, they basically don't care about all the different principles of what makes justice and what defines justice, and is this genocide, is this not genocide? They don't care about that. You're actually talking to people that know already that this is a genocide, but to them it's justified. To them it's justified. As long as it gets me to the power, that's all that matters. So when you look at this psychology, why am I actually talking about it? Because when you surround yourself with people that live their life based on taking things as basically a place of pleasure, a place of mockery, a place of lacking seriousness, you're going to adopt the same psychology. And this is extremely important. I had seen that in prisons so many times. The ones to just, oh, who cares, and just walk away and not care. Why? They were probably living this life that in order to be in power, that you basically have to be the bully. You have to be the bully. You have to be the one to show that you don't care. Because the second that you show that you care, according to their psychology, is that second that you will be abused by others that don't care. So to make sure that you protect yourself from other bullies, you just have to become a stronger bully that does not recognize principle. And this is extremely important to keep in mind, because Islam recognizes this psychology and its impact. Yes, Islam has later its way dealing with these people, but one thing is Sha'rawi says a very beautiful thing, and he says, even though we know their presence within our society, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to isolate from these people that are not taking their religion seriously, that to them, this type of behavior is what makes them in power. But we need the whole society to actually teach them that this is not getting you anywhere. In other words, the whole society is disciplining them and telling them, we're going to avoid you. If you think that lacking compassion or lacking passion in religion or lacking seriousness in principle, that it's going to make you look cool, think again. We're going to not make you feel cool, and we're going to practice that ذَرِ الَّذِينَ. We're going to practice of letting you feel that you're nothing but this isolated piece of dust that no one cares about. And this is important. In order to give you power with these type of bullies is don't give them attention. Don't give them attention. When they mock, don't let them recognize or feel that you were hurt, and just don't give them attention, and just basically walk away. And that's when they would basically die out. الشافعي, this is a beautiful poem. And he said, إذا سبني نذل تزايدت رفعة وما العيب إلا أن أكون مساببه يزيد تفاهة أزيد حلما كعود زاده الإحراق طيبا. يا سلام. What does that mean? So الشافعي said, إذا سبني نذل, if someone that lacks principle had in any shape or form sabbani, used derogatory words to somehow humiliate me, I would basically increase in my value. تزايدت رفعة, I would increase in my value. How? He demonstrates how he does that. He said he would increase in saying the wrong words, but I would basically just let go, and I would, in that situation, just let the fire that he is trying to burn me with burn him instead. He's burning in fire, and he's basically trying to attack me by provoking my calmness. And once he provokes my calmness, then he had won. But once I demonstrate that I'm still very calm and that's not hurting me, and that his fire is burning but on no one but himself, it basically becomes nothing to burn me. And therefore, I would continue to be strong. And كعود زاده الإحراق طيبا, I would be basically, when that incense, you basically burn it, and what happens to it? It basically gets out all the beautiful incense and all the beautiful smell. And therefore, I would basically keep my incense right there preserved, and I wouldn't burn. I would burn at the right time with the right things and the right situation and etc. at the right time to let that beautiful incense come out, and not necessarily get that person to burn me and make me die out. Okay, when we look at this whole psychology of how they might actually demonstrate it and how they play the game, when in English, I think it was they use something that really gives the same meaning, that if you were to basically perhaps wrestle or even get into the pigs area of, like their swamp and all their area of mud pool, if you try to engage in their mud pool and probably try to get dragged inside, they would definitely overcome you, because that's their area of play. That's what they master. So if you were to get dragged into their swamp, into their mud area, you basically are really dragged, and you basically had lost the game, because they just wanted to drag you in their area of mud. And this is important. In those situations, Islam teaches you how to avoid these bullies, and basically, just let them go. Just don't give them attention, and don't let them distract you. Who are those people? Those that would take their religion as a place of play, as a place of lacking seriousness, not an issue to necessarily embrace. And lahwa. What is lahu? Lahu is a place of pleasure. Any place of pleasure is basically lahu. This ayah reminds us of the ayah in Surah al-Hadid, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, إِنَّمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ وَزِينَةٌ وَتَفَاخُرٌ بَيْنَكُمْ وَتَكَاثُرٌ فِي الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَوْلَادِ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us about al-hayat al-dunya, that it's nothing but la'ib in your early stages of life, it's nothing but play, and then it's lahu, and then you're in this age of trying to display your beauty because you start recognizing basically the importance of your appearance, the importance of your power in this whole game of basically competition over dunya, and then you would see yourself engaging in that game. And then go farther. Once your children, your money, your power basically is right now at a place where you didn't have before, then that's when you get into another type of competition. That's dunya. And then he tells us that it's exactly like you would see the greenery. You would see the crops basically coming in as green and full and complete, and then once they dry out and it's harvest time, as if all that greenery was not there, telling us that even your wealth, your life is exactly like that. It comes in as green, and then you grow older and you harden, and your body even would have less moisture and less water, and then you would basically die out. كمثل غيث أعجب الكفار نباته ثم يهيج فتراه مصفرا ثم يجعله حطاما. And then it becomes nothing but small ashes, perhaps once all that hay is harvested, and all that hay is basically time to remove it in order to make a new crop. It becomes basically the cycle of life. Now here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us غَرَّتْهُمُ الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا. That's relating to the ayah that we just read. Why are they living their life in لعبا ولهوا? It's because غَرَّتْهُمُ الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيا. What is al-ghurur? الغرور or الغرور. الغرور is arrogance. الغرور is to have the wrong vision and to see something in the wrong image. That's الغرور. Okay? When you have the wrong image and you have the wrong impression of something, that's basically when you confuse your data, you confuse your interpretation of something, and then basically the consequence is that your stance is going basically in accordance with the data and the interpretation that you laid out. But now your behavior later on, you probably discovered that your data and your interpretation were both misreading the reality. Okay, so that's غرتهم الحياة الدنيا. They were engaging in this dunya like it's what their place of seriousness is. In other words, money, it's all about getting money. It's all about getting perhaps maybe the attention, the attraction, all of that. That's what matters. They were reading the wrong data. They were focusing on the wrong data about life, about the meaning of life, about the purpose of life, and certainly about the basis that they should be living their life based on. That's غرتهم الحياة الدنيا وذكر به أن تبسل. ذكر. Now, your stance. Now, you recognize these bullies. You recognize their life. They're putting you down. But here's one thing. Should I just ذرهم? Should I just avoid them completely? Or do I still have to do a certain relationship, a certain behavior? Do I still have to do something in order to relate to them in a certain way? ذكر به. You still have to do one thing. Remind them. Remind them of what? أن تبسل نفس بما كسبت. that what is tubsal? Tubsal, it comes from the root absala. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Absala actually means to see the consequence of your choices. And the consequence here is really the consequence, meaning the destruction that you are going to be facing. Whether it's a punishment or whether it's a destruction or whether it's basically seeing the fate of the choices that you had made. Okay? So this ayah is telling you, ذكر به. Remind using what? The word bihi. Is this talking about ذكر bihi, meaning the pronoun bihi? Is this referring to the Quran? Or is this referring to Islam in general? Or is this referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Am I going to use Quran to remind these people of what they are taking basically in mockery? Or am I going to use and talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or am I going to talk about the akhirah? Or am I going to talk about what am I going to? All of those different things were actually mentioned as being what this pronoun is referring to. Al-akhirah, al-Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all of those were actually mentioned as being what the pronoun bihi is referring to. But here's one thing. When you look at أن تبسل نفس بما كسبت ليس لها من دون الله ولي ولا شفيع, that then takes you that regardless of what the pronoun bihi was referring to, that you are basically right there reminding them of that fate when they would basically end up seeing the consequence and the fate of the choices of what data that they were basically misreading about dunya and what interpretation that they had made and what their life was based on, and that how that's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created their life for, and therefore remind them أن تبسل نفس بما كسبت. Remind them on Judgment Day that there's going to be a day where every single soul, every single person would be held accountable on their own individually, and they're not going to be in groups, meaning individually, and that you will be asked as an individual for and about what choices you had taken and how you read the data that was presented to you, basically from Quran, from the prophets, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How did you read it? How did you interpret it? Whether interpret it in your vision or whether interpret it in action. What did you do with it? And this ayah is basically letting us do and this type of conversation when, yes, we're avoiding their company, we're avoiding that environment, but that does not mean that we don't do our duty in doing that da'wah. This is important. Yes, we're avoiding that company, but we are still doing our da'wah whenever possible. وَذَكِّرْ بِهِ. So to avoid them does not mean that we don't do their duty in doing the da'wah. Whenever possible, do your da'wah to remind them of every single soul and that they would not have any salvation outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you look at لَيْسَ لَهَا مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ وَلِيٌّ وَلَا شَفِيعٌ. What's the difference between al-wali and al-shafi'? Al-wali is basically a place of authority, a place of authority, a place of security, a place of protection. That's al-wali. Okay? Place of authority, protection, all of those, decision, etc. That's al-wali. Okay. Now, ish-shafi', that's right there. Ish-shafi' is basically an intercessor. What's the difference? Intercessor and wali. Al-wali is basically a leader, is basically a decision maker, is basically a salvation. In other words, they're considered as their place of power. Ish-shafi' is under the place of power. Ish-shafi' is an intercessor. It basically consider it as an assistance to the wali, and Shafi' would basically be the one to be as the person in the middle. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, well, they would not have any salvation, any security, any power outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the only sole power on Judgment Day that there is. And even if they were to possibly think someone X or Y or any position that it would intercede, that it would basically give them the privilege to get away from the consequence of what choices that they had made, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making it clear that no, not outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepting or consenting to this type of intercession. So in other words, it goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِن تَعْدِلْ كُلَّ عَدْلٍ لَا يُؤْخَذْ مِنْهَا. What is تَعْدِلْ كُلَّ عَدْلٍ? This isn't talking about justice. So even if they were to put forth any part or any value of anything, therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not take anything from them. And in other words, nothing would be equivalent to what they had won. They had believed in faith or what they had practiced in amal salih. Nothing would be equivalent to. That's the only presentation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be taking. أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ أُبْسِلُوا بِمَا كَسَبُوا. Those would be the ones, the word أُبْسِلُوا, remember the root is أَبْسَلَ, not بَسَلَ. Okay, أَبْسَلَ. So أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ أُبْسِلُوا بِمَا كَسَبُوا. Those would be the ones to basically find their fate, in other words, be destructed or be accountable, be held accountable for what they had kasabu. What is al-kasb? Kasaba actually means one, to gain. Kasaba could also mean to contribute. And kasaba could also mean to harvest. Okay, so when you're looking at bima kasabu, in other words, what did they contribute in? What did they gain? And what did they basically contribute? Well, we said contribute, we said gain, and certainly that's exactly what they're going to harvest. Okay, in other words, their life, their life was a test, and therefore, if they had taken their deen, their vision about life as a place that is not a person, not a practice of seriousness, not seriously. They didn't see it as a place of compassion, as a place of passion. They didn't see it as a place of seriousness. They read the data based on the lens of dunya, that it's just this life, nothing but matter in motion, nothing to be taken seriously. So they basically lived their life based on this wrong interpretation of life, and they lived it based on lahu, just mere play. And lahum sharabun min hamim. At the end, nas'allah al-afwa al-afiyah, that they would basically have a drink that comes from il-hamim. Al-hamim, it can mean friend, but this isn't talking about a friend, like a soulmate. This isn't talking about a soulmate. This is actually talking about the different heated or hot boiled drinks that would be on Judgment Day. Nas'Allah al-afwa al-afiyah. وَعَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. Man, just thinking about it, it really makes my stomach hurt. Okay. وَعَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْفُرُونَ. They would have a torment, a painful torment for what they had denied. But wait a minute, why were they called yakfurun? They could be Muslim, right? Well, if a Muslim is taking their religion as a place of lahu and a place of mockery, that gets them out of the fold of Islam. Just keep that one in mind. That gets the Muslim outside of the fold of Islam. If they're taking the religion, there's a difference between a person that's not taking their religion seriously, meaning that you tell them about this being haram and they'll say, inshallah, I will do tawbah. They recognize that it's haram. But a person that is mocking the religion or mocking the salihin, how is that? What do you mean by mocking the salihin? Yes, they're mocking, let's say maybe niqab or maybe hijab, or mocking the believers, they don't necessarily just mean to mock the hijab or mock the believers, okay, just because they have a personal issue. No, they're mocking them because they want to mock the religion. Just like in Surah At-Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them, لَقَدْ كَفَرْتُمْ, you had, after you had become Muslim, you had just became, right there, you had just become a disbeliever. By mocking who? Well, they were mocking the mu'mineen, saying that, oh, they're the ones that would be the first to come to food, but they would be the last to come in battle. They would be the ones to basically be the أجبننا عند اللقاء. They said they would be the ones to be the cowards whenever we would meet the enemy. What did they really want to say? They were speaking about al-Qurra. They were speaking about the ones to recite the most Quran. They were mocking them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered that just by saying these words, even though they were mocking the believers and not necessarily mocking, okay, a personal thing about, X or Y or Z, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered that no, you were mocking them for the faith that they embrace, that they display, that they hold. That's what you intended to mock. And that's why it's really important. I would see this a lot on university campuses. They would be a group of religious girls. They're usually not too many, but a group of religious girls, and those religious girls would usually have I guess a closed group. They're trying to maintain their deen. They would probably memorize the Quran together, probably work together and meet together, etc. And then you got another bigger group that's trying to be inclusive, and within their inclusive group they're putting in al-kuffar, they're putting in, of course, in Arabic we say اللي بيسوى واللي ما بيسوى, basically including everyone in it. And then what happens? They're not practicing that. And for those that don't embrace the religion and take it seriously, if you don't embrace it and take it seriously, you're going to end up really becoming a part of that group, and you're going to start losing your religion little by little. Certainly, leave that line to do that. وَذَكِّرْ بِهِ. Certainly, leave that line to remind others, but not at the expense of your faith. You know what I'm going to take you to? I want to take you to another thing that I had prepared. I want you to see this one. And I liked, some of the quotes that this article had basically quoted. I want you to look at this one. And he was saying, well, it is not permissible to be a friend to the non-Muslims. This isn't talking about, being a friend to meaning having some acquaintances, or sometimes sitting down and sharing some things. This isn't talking about acquaintances, but this is actually talking about having deep relations, whether it's a disbeliever or whether it's basically even Muslims that are deviant. Okay, why? Because protecting your deen is more important. Let's see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَتَّخِذُوا الْيَهُودَ وَالنَّصَارَى أَوْلِيَاءَ بعضهم أولياء بعض ومن يتولهم منكم فإنه منهم إن الله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, oh, you who believe, do not take the Jews and the Christians as awliya. What is awliya? Awliya, 1, the decision makers. 2, the ones to basically be as your protectors. 3, the ones to basically be in authority. In other words, for Yahud, Nasara, Christian, perhaps a Hindu, Jew, whatever it is, at the end, you as a Muslim, if you want to take a wali, you want to take perhaps somebody to be as your advisor, someone to be as perhaps the wise person that you probably share certain maybe private stuff. Sometimes you probably want their advice on something, their input on something. It cannot be a Christian or a Jew. It cannot be a bad deviant Muslim either. it must be a person that has their basis, their lens is based on seeing the world through Quran and Sunnah. That's their lens. If their lens is not based on Quran and Sunnah, then are you using a different lens? Are you reading your data based on a lens of feminism and probably individualism, universalism, and all those isms and postmodernism and all of that and atheism? Are you using someone else's lens and you are reading your life and your decisions and what decisions you should be taking and reading probably the different stances of whether your social life or whether your decisions or whether, because for a mu'min, they're seeing their deen as their number one place. That's the first thing. They have their own reading. Deen, nafs, aql, ird, mal, reading all of that based on Quran and Sunnah. They have a completely different lens. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْض. They would be supporters and they would have supporting one another, but for you as a Muslim, وَمَن يَتَوَلَّهُم مِّنكُمْ فَإِنَّهُ مِنْهُمْ. Whoever takes them as their place of authority, then he's part of them. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الظَّالِمِينَ. The Lord Almighty does not guide those that basically had oppressed one another, or those that, what is dhulm? Dhulm is going beyond the limit. That's a dhulm. مجاوزة الحد. It's going beyond the limit. So when a person goes beyond the limit, what limit? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set his limit. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined a certain limit, defined what makes right and wrong, defined what acts as the basis of truth and what acts as the basis of false, what is toxic, what is not toxic, what is discipline, what is not discipline, what is this value, what is that value, how do I organize my social dynamic, how do I organize my priorities, what is my, all of these different things. Islam has its own definition. What is the definition of justice? How do I relate to my husband, my parents, my siblings, all of that? That's defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, if a person goes beyond the limit, the borders and the premise that Allah subhanahu, or the area that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the borders that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically laid out, then that's a person that had exceeded the limit. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then tells us, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا بطانة من دونكم لا يألونكم خبالا ودوا ما عنتم قد بدت البغضاء من أفواههم وما تخفي صدورهم أكبر قد بينا الآيات لكم الآيات إن كنتم تعقلون قد بينا لكم الآيات إن كنتم تعقلون. That for the believers, he said, well, when you, what is البطانة? البطانة is to take like a cloak. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, well, there's a certain not only garment, but don't let those garments, those appearances that some might give you, that they're actually supporting you, that they understand how you feel, and all of those rhetorical words that they might give you. لا يألونكم خبالا. They don't really care about not even the smallest thing that might actually be of a place of consideration. وَدُّوا مَا عَنِتُّمْ قَدْ بَدَتِ الْبَغْضَاءُ مِنْ أَفْوَاهِهِمْ. They might say these words and of course these hurtful words, etc., but what their hearts conceal is even far worse. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that what is important is that we would recognize that when we take our supporters, the people that surround us, and certainly our friends, they have to be the friends that see the vision of Quran and Sunnah and use that to help us understand, read the data, recognize the data, interpret the data right, and basically do the right practice and put in the right implementation of what stances we should be taking. That's why الإمام القرطبي quote, he said, نهى الله عز وجل المؤمنين بهذه الآية أن يتخذوا من الكفار واليهود وأهل الأهواء دخلاء وولجاء. He said in quote, he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid the believers in this ayah to take the disbelievers or even the Jews or even the people of pleasures. In other words, the people that live their life based on pleasures, to take them as dukhala, as friends, as the ones to enter in their life. They don't belong in your life. They don't have the vision right. So therefore, you don't want to take those people as the ones to basically let you determine what's right and what's wrong for you. Well, this isn't just talking about friends, but this is also talking about someone that might be called a therapist. Even if they're called a therapist and they're presented like they are, that they are the ones to basically come from the place of science and studies, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the right interpretation. Just be careful with that one. Even if they're called a therapist, one thing is that the Western society eliminated religious roles and religious power by replacing it with a lot of those therapists that used whether they'll tell you to use yoga, they'll tell you to have basically, as long as you're comfortable with it, that's what all matters and all of that, because they're actually based on atheist foundation. They're based on, and many that would actually study psychology, they would tell you that, no, it's not necessarily atheist, etc. But if you were to actually go in the back end, you were to study the history, and many didn't actually study epistemology to really scrutinize the difference between a study and an interpretation and how we interpret such studies. How do we interpret such studies? That interpretation can be relative. That interpretation, we can have one action and then we can interpret it differently. But once you would read such interpretation that's basically coming from an atheistic view, from a postmodern view, from a feminist view, from a universalist perception, then that's exactly what's happening right now, is that they're telling you that that's what studies say, not that's what their interpretation of what sometimes they had induced a certain data in order to come about with a certain conclusion, in order to basically impose a certain ideology. They would present it like it's an objective thing, but you discover that it was not objective. It was actually coming from a certain ideology that was imposed upon us as if it is what studies say. You want to be really careful with that. So that's why this is extremely important, because he was saying that يريد الذين يتبعون الشهوات أن تميلوا ميلا عظيما, that those that basically would follow their pleasures, they also want you to engage deeper and deeper in that, because they consider that life is about maximizing pleasure. Ibn Kathir says that the followers of shaitan, from the Jews and the Christians, and even those that would engage in adultery or fornication, they want you to engage further and further in what they're engaging in, because they don't want to be the only ones to engage in the wrong thing. And Lucy had explained, well, that's basically talking about the pleasures and all of that. That's referring, as a metaphor, referring to zina. But here's one thing. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا تصاحب إلا مؤمنا ولا يأكل طعامك إلا تقي. Only be friends with a mu'min, with a believer. And when you eat, only eat with a person that embraces piety. Why? Because if you don't recognize, when you eat with someone, it basically has a different thing that might actually start coming in farther than just food. It's ideas, indoctrination. It's basically normalization of fitna. That's that normalization that you really want to be careful of. And he said right there, al-Khattabi. Al-Khattabi is actually, I would say, a scholar that really needs better scrutiny. He was a scholar that did sharh for Sunan Abu Dawood, but I think he didn't get the appreciation that he deserves. We'll talk about him later. He said that that the Prophet ﷺ had cautioned from being companions with those that don't have taqwa, and had even told us not to even engage with them or even eat with them, because food itself could actually bring in further relationship, and it basically brings in a form of al-ulf wal-mawadda. What is al-ulf? Al-ulf is normalization. When you're normalized with something, you're basically accepting it, you're becoming accustomed to it. It becomes as something that your heart itself would reconciliate with. And then with this, he said, لا تؤالف من ليس من أهل التقوى والورع ولا تتخذه جليسا تطاعمه وتنادمه. And do not sit and do not basically normalize your relationship with those that are not of أهل التقوى, not of piety, and not of wara, and do not take them as your companions to basically sit and eat with them and so forth, because in Faid al-Qadir al-Manawi, basically, he said one thing. He said the highest level of Iman is basically recognizing that faith is their priority. Okay? Why? Because it's part of our psychology that we would, without us realizing, we would mimic. And he used the word at-tiba' sarraqa. What does that mean? Without you realizing, in Arabic, if I were to make a verbatim translation, he was saying that our habits are stolen, plagiarized from others. But if you were to say plagiarized from others, we're talking about without you realizing your habits and what you display, it's really mirroring and mimicking the people that you surround yourself with. So in other words, surround yourself with those that demonstrate and live the best of actions. It will in itself actually bring in the fruit within you to bring in basically those behaviors and start demonstrating them. And that's basically what will later on will fruit and will start coming out as the behavior, as the new identity of what you are. So in other words, even if you may feel that I'm not like these people, they're actually better than me, Shaitan will come in and tell you, you know that you're nothing but a hypocrite. You don't belong with them. You're not even like them. You know they're talking about Qiyam al-Layl, but you know yourself that you don't even do Qiyam al-Layl. You're struggling with your own Isha. And they're already at that Qiyam al-Layl, and they're talking about Qiyam al-Layl, and you're just right there sitting with them. You know that they are not like you. Shaitan will come in. Shaitan will come in to basically get you to feel that you don't belong with the Salihin. But remember, those ayat, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ. Be patient. Let that time that you're surrounding yourself with their barakah, with their blessing, give it some time, and it will go from being a surface, from something that you are seeing, to something that your heart will embrace, your heart will get accustomed to. You will see that that's what you will love little by little, and inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will let that be something from just like الشجرة الطيبة أصلها ثابت وفرعها في السماء. The grounding of it, the root, is basically a strong root, but then فرعها في السماء, it will start to fruit, it will start to display later on outside publicly. It will basically be in that area that you will first start with the seed, and it will later on fruit as you move on. And certainly, when we're speaking about those ayat and those ahadith and basically what the scholars were saying in regards to the tafsir in relationship with those, the last time we basically had the homework to have certain sisters give us certain similar ayat that relate to the same subject. And let's say Khasatullah, she basically said Surah An-Nisa ayah 140. Let's go to that ayah. Okay, Surah An-Nisa ayah 140, and let's go right there. Hold on, let's get there, and let's see. I'm trying to, we're going to get there, inshallah. Okay, it doesn't want to give me, wonder why it's not giving me that. Okay, but it's not letting me actually see it completely. That's weird. Okay, it's okay. You know what I'll do? I'll basically just get Surah An-Nisa ayah 140 rather than on this PDF. We'll get a different one, right? Let's do this one. We'll put Surah An-Nisa and 140. Okay, let's look at it right there. Sorry, here we go. Oh dear, what happened? My laptop is not too happy. It's basically having too many files open and it's not too happy. Okay, that's all right. We'll basically use Surah An-Nisa ayah 140. Hopefully I can actually share what you had. Let's see if I can. Oh, it's not allowing me. Oh dear, it's not allowing me. Okay, you know what? Let's do this. Let's see if I can actually do this one. Okay, I'm going to use that one and see if we could add the text right there. Oh, here we go. It basically gave it to me. Okay, but hopefully I can make it into black. And there we go. Okay. Oh dear.
It's written in the chat.
It's written in the chat, but it's not allowing me to share the chat. Okay. It's not allowing me to share the chat. That's all right. وَقَدْ نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الْكِتَابِ أَنْ إِذَا سَمِعْتُمْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ يُكْفَرُ بِهَا. Even when I wanted to write وَقَدْ نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ أَنْ إِذَا سَمِعْتُمْ. Let's hope it basically. Okay, here we go. Finally, it opened up. Here we go. This is the ayah right there. Here we go. So a similar ayah right there. وَقَدْ نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الْكِتَابِ أن إذا سمعتم آيات الله يكفر بها ويستهزأ بها فلا تقعدوا معهم حتى يخوضوا في حديث غيره إنكم إذا مثلهم إن الله جامع المنافقين والكافرين في جهنم جميعا. That's probably the most ayah that is similar to the ayah that we're covering. And when it was revealed, when we did Tafseer Surah An-Nisa, we actually went in details with this Tafseer in ayah. Let's see, that if you hear the ayat, notice that it said, Sami'atum ayatillah, but the other one was actually speaking about seeing. Okay, let's see, where was that? The other one was actually talking about seeing, basically that behavior, ra'ayta. In this ayah, it was talking about sami'tum, hearing. Okay, so seeing or hearing, at the end, it's basically an environment that surrounds you. If you hear the ayat, yukfaru biha, wa yustahza'u biha. If you hear that the verses of the ayat Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are basically mocked or basically denied, فَلَا تَقْعُدُوا مَعَهُمْ, then don't sit with them. So this one's saying, لا تقعدوا معهم. What is this one saying? أعرض عنهم. Turn away. So the other one is basically saying, don't sit with them. In other words, what are you doing? So either it's don't sit, don't stand, don't surround yourself with these people حتى يخوضوا في حديث غيره, until they would engage in a different conversation. And إنكم إذا مثلهم. Just by engaging in such conversations, just by engaging in such basically environment, then you had become part of them. You would be part of them. And this ayah is basically telling us, well, فَلَا تَقْعُدْ, do not sit So in other words, here we go again, that when you're sitting down, when you're getting accustomed, normalizing with something, again, the ayat are basically reminding us again and again, don't sit with this kind of environment, don't engage, don't necessarily surround yourself not with seeing it, whether it's a reel or whether it's basically an ad or whatever it is. Turn your face away, or even listening to it, and certainly don't even listen to that type of conversation. إن الله جامع المنافقين والكافرين في جهنم جميعا. For the Lord Almighty is going to be combining basically المنافقين والكافرين. What's the difference between a munafiq and a kafir? المنافق is a person that may display faith and conceal kufr. And المنافق may have faith on the inside, but display the behavior of kufr. There's a munafiq amal and a munafiq aqidah. Munafiq aqidah, that's a kafir. A munafiq amal, إذا آية المنافق ثلاث إذا حدث كذب وإذا وعد أخلف وإذا أتمنى خان. That the signs of a munafiq are basically three things. Either when they speak, they lie. وَإِذَا وَعَدَ أَخْلَفَ, and they promise, they break their promises. وَإِذَا أَتُمِنَ خَانَ, and when they would be trusted, they would betray. Is that a Muslim? That's a Muslim. But the Prophet ﷺ is saying, well, they have faith on the inside, but what they're displaying is basically the behavior of a disbeliever. So that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically telling us that those are munafiqeen if they were to engage in such behavior. Now, why are we mentioning all of that? Well, that's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was wanting us to know how to protect our own faith before we would engage in any of those relationships that may actually jeopardize and put our own faith at risk. قُلْ أَنَدْعُو مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ مَا لَا يَنْفَعُنَا وَلَا يَضُرُّنَا. And this is going to be the last ayah. We're just going to comment just a little bit on it, and then inshallah, we're going to be ending and answering questions. And say, should we nad'u? When the word nad'u can mean na'budu as well. Do we worship other than the Lord Almighty? Other than the Lord Almighty, the things that do not bring benefit or harm, and we would basically face our fate. Is it thought al-aqib was the feet? How did we get there? After Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had guided us as the one that was put in delusion from shaitan on earth, and they would be living in hayran. What is al-hayran? Living in confusion, in an illusion, in a delusion. Which one is it? له أصحاب يدعونه إلى الهدى ائتنا. He would have friends that would basically tell him to come to guidance. But of course, قل إن هدى الله هو الهدى. Just stand with firmness, determination, and say the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the true guidance. وَأُمِرْنَا لِنُسْلِمَ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And we were ordered to لِنُسْلِمَ. Is that meaning Islam, or is that meaning submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the Lord of the people, or al-alameen, worlds? Which one is it? وَأَنْ أَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَاتَّقُوهُ وَهُوَ الَّذِي إِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ. And to perform prayer and to have piety, for you would be resurrected to Him. Okay, what we're going to do, inshallah, tomorrow, we need to still go to Qurtubi and go over these ayat. We still didn't do that yet. Okay, these ayat based on Tafseer al-Qurtubi, and inshallah, cover a couple things. This one is really exciting to talk about, so we'll talk about that, inshallah, tomorrow. In the meantime, the sisters, yesterday we didn't have enough time to answer questions. Sorry, I needed to go suddenly. Okay, but if there are any questions or if there are any comments, I'd love to hear them. So go ahead, my friends. What would you like to say, or what would you like to comment? Everybody prefers that